Today we're going to discuss a writing by Elisha Williams, who lived during the Colonial period, and it's called The Essential Rights and Privileges of Protestants. It was written in 1744, given to the Connecticut General Assembly. Basically, he argues four things to argue for religious liberty. First of all, he uses John Locke and his theory of toleration and his theory of government, mixes those together, basically saying that it's a natural right. Freedom of religion is a natural right. Second, he talks about the Christian's obligation to obey the scriptures as he or she interprets them. Okay, so there's a freedom of interpretation because it's a matter of conscience. Third, he goes into Christian liberty and argues from that. And then fourth, he argues that the state, because it's supposed to defend our natural rights, is obligated to defend our right to the freedom of religion. So they're obligated to defend our religious liberty. So what is this first argument? And by the way, he will deal with how to interpret things like Romans 13, the first 6 verses, as in the process of this. And we'll go over that because that's a text which says that Christians are obey the ruling authorities, and some take this to mean obey the ruling authorities no matter what. And he's going to show why that's not the case. Okay, so let's go to this aspect of John Locke and the fact that he's fusing together Locke's view of toleration together with his understanding of government. What was it that Locke, as a background here, understood about civil government? Well, hopefully we're all familiar with inalienable rights. That's part of the Declaration of Independence. You see, we have these inalienable rights. Well, what is an inalienable right according to John Locke? You might say, well, it's a right that others can't deny you. Isn't that right? And that is true. But it's actually more than that. It's a right that you can't deny yourself. All right? It's inalienable. You can't alienate yourself from it, perhaps. So Locke believes that in a hypothetical state where people are not under government, that they have these rights, and the right is life and liberty and property. Okay, why property for Locke? Well, it's because you have the right to life, and therefore you have the right to the means of your labor to supply your life. You know, for instance, if you till a field, you have the right to enjoy the fruits of it in a state of nature. Of course, you have to defend those rights at that particular point. And therefore you have kind of a right to property because, especially in a farming community, you need that land to have, to be kind of what is yours in order to actually gain the results of your labor. So Locke believed these were inalienable rights that, one couldn't deny themselves from. Now, of course, you're able to give up some of your, your property if you wish, but you couldn't give it all up and give up your life as a process in the process without violating your obligation to your own life. And so if that's the case, Locke is saying, look, when people create a government, hypothetically, they're creating a government from this understanding of liberty in a state of nature. When they agree and contract together to create a government, they aren't even allowed, if you will, to contract together contract away those rights. They can't say, oh, I agree to go into a government with you where I'm going to forfeit my life unjustly. You can't do that, all right, because these are inalienable rights. So you can't alienate yourself from those rights when you make a contract for government. And that's why they're natural rights. Okay, well, then Locke argued in his letter on toleration that we should tolerate, the government should tolerate various religious positions, and not require a particular state religion and impose penalties on churches for violating the state religion or anything like that. So what Elisha Williams does is he argues that he kind of puts these together in a sense and says that religious freedom, related to this view of toleration, religious freedom is a natural right, just like the right to life is a natural right. And so the right to worship as you believe is proper before God, that's a natural right that is inalienable, according to Williams. You can't give it up. Even when you agree to gather together with others in a religious state, you can't give that up. You might even say you have an obligation before God, which he's going to go into, not to give it up. So that's how he puts together Locke, all right? And that brings us to that second step, which is that Christians, and here he is going to be talking about Christians and Christian liberty, specifically, because remember, we're dealing with this background here of these ministers, these Christian ministers, and Connecticut wants to, regulate Christianity at that point. So he is dealing with that, but you will see that some of these, we get to the end, we'll talk about how some of these principles might relate to other religions and how they do in the furtherance of the United States. So obligation, the Christian, second point is Christians are obligated to believe and obey the scriptures as they understand them. Okay, in other words, it's Christian conscience and liberty of conscience. All goes, big theme going back to the Protestant Reformation, and found in the New Testament. So, as a result of this obligation to believe and obey the scriptures as one understands them, Williams acknowledges there's going to be people who interpret those scriptures differently within certain parameters as Protestants that are legitimate. And here he's dealing with Protestants. We'll go into that as well. But so he says essentially a little bit later too that, look, Protestants have all together gathered in Boston. We've had Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quakers, and so forth. And so each of these people think of it differently about religion, and they're obligated to worship God as they understand the scriptures. So, as a result, in a sense, the state, if it's not going to violate their Christian conscience, has to allow for the freedom of religion. Okay. And that's where basically it's connected to the idea of Christian liberty. All right. This is, liberty of conscience is Christian liberty. So the third aspect here is Christian liberty. And he's going to expand on that, though, in Christian liberty in the kind of the negative sense. That is, that the government can't impose upon your religious worship in a way that you don't believe God is imposing upon you. Okay? So there's first the positive aspect of obligation to the scriptures, second point. And here's kind of like the negative side of it. That the state has no right to impose upon you religious obligations that you don't believe the scriptures require of you. He uses the example in worship. The state can't require that you either stand or kneel in worship. That's kind of a big deal going back in the history of England, because the Anglican Church at points was required state religion. Not always, but at numerous points. So that is, the state does not have a right to impose upon you things that you don't believe the scriptures impose upon you for religious worship. All right. Now we'll get to the issue of how this relates to the state, though. When civil matters, that's going to be different. But in religious worship, the state can't impose these things upon you. So that is an emphasis on Christian liberty and freedom of conscience in worship. Now, within that, before we get to our fourth point, this is where he deals with Romans 13. Because he asked the question, which, maybe some of you are thinking, but there are New Testament passages which tell us to obey the powers that be. That's Romans 13, about the first 6 verses. You need to obey the powers that be because they're instituted by God. All right? And their authority comes from God. They're meant to do you good, not to do you evil. And so some will use this passage to say, okay, if you're called to obey the governing authorities, certainly you have to obey them at least in matters that, you have to obey them at least in matters that aren't contrary to the scriptures. But let's just go with a general sense. It sounds like you just have to obey them, period. And he says, no, that can't be the case, because it would create a contradiction between two authorities. Let's say the state requires you to do one thing, the scriptures require you to do another. Now, as a Christian, I believe the scriptures are inspired by God and they're God's revelation. So do you obey the scripture? Well, in this case, when they're in conflict, if you think you're supposed to obey the state when it's in conflict with the scriptures, then it's like God is contradicting himself. All right? Because, I put it this way. The scriptures are God's authority. And he basically is going to argue that Romans 13 is only saying obey the governing authorities insofar as they represent the authority of God. Okay. Because that's what the text is talking about. They're God's servants to do you good. They're servants of God. But when they're not, then you have to obey the scriptures. In other words, they're servants of God, but it's showing that when they disobey the scriptures, when they call you to disobey the scriptures, they're not being God's servants. Okay. If you think otherwise, it's like God's contradicting himself. He's got this source of scripture and this source of the governing authorities. Like he's giving authority equally through both. And yet they contradict each other. It would be like God speaking out both sides of his mouth, right? So he's saying, no, the authority of the scriptures is clearly the authority of God. So if the state requires you to do otherwise, in that instance, it does not represent the authority of God. And I think he can apply this as well to, as he's talked about natural rights, he could talk about this in relation to natural revelation and natural rights when the state requires you to do things contrary to your natural rights. They're not exercising God-given authority, and you're required to disobey them. I mean, if the state said to you, you must commit suicide, you have to disobey it. Okay, so that's obviously when the state requires you to do something positively that's against the scriptures. What if, on the other hand, the state says to you something negative, like the negative side of this? Well, we're not requiring you to do something that the scriptures don't require. We're not telling you to do something that the scriptures is opposed to. The scriptures don't even talk about this. They don't even bring this up as far as religious worship goes. And so we're not contradicting the scriptures when we tell you to do this, when we tell you gotta kneel or stand, for instance, or all kinds of other things it could be. Okay. And so they say, we're not disagreeing with the authority of God because he never says anything about that. So, of course, you're supposed to obey us. And what Williams points out is, look, if that's the case, then the state could require all kinds of things of us in worship. It could be so extraneous. He doesn't say this, but it'd be almost practically impossible to worship. I mean, they get to the point where they could require so many things that it is a burden upon the church. Okay. So he says, no, not in religious worship. The state has no authority there to require things of us that the scriptures do not require of us. Well, then, what about civil issues? And that's interesting because what he says is, even in civil issues, when the state requires of you things that go beyond the ends of the state, you are not required to obey them. The end of the state, he would say, the purpose of the state, is to protect our lives and our property. And when the state goes beyond that to require things of us that don't accord with that, we're not obligated to obey. When the state does that, it's become tyrannical. He gives an example. What if the state were to tell us all that Sunday afternoon at a certain time, let's say 2 p.m., all of us had to stand on one heel and twirl ourselves in a circle so that everybody is doing that at 2 p.m., say Sunday afternoon. That would have absolutely nothing to do with the end and purpose of the state, and we would have no obligation to obey it. In fact, in some respect, we would be required not to, because it would be considered tyrannical. He says anybody who thought that would obviously know the government is being tyrannical if they required that kind of thing. So, that explains how he's looking at the state, all right, in terms of natural rights. And basically the state is there to guarantee our natural rights. You see, he used the very example from, in effect, from Locke there, that the ends of the state is to protect our lives and property. Okay? Like we have the right to life and property, according to Locke. So he's reiterating that and saying that when it goes beyond that, it's become tyrannical. And basically he says, look to Locke as, an explanation of all this. So Locke has already said the same thing before. And then he says, look to Locke for the remedies for how to deal with tyrannical government. Locke, by the way, talks about noting your grievances, which is what the Americans did in the Declaration of Independence, and stating, all the things that have gone on and why the government is tyrannical. But anyways, you can look at Locke for more detail on that. So then he goes through a couple things that are interesting. Let's recap what we've done so far. Okay, so first of all, we've talked about the fact that there are these four things, and I haven't even got to the fourth yet, but the first three that we've gone through is John Locke's view of toleration and his view of natural rights in government. Secondly, the Christian's obligation to obey the scriptures. Third, their freedom and liberty of conscience, not to have things required of them that shouldn't be required of them. And it's in that context that he's giving these questions about Romans 13. Don't we obey the powers that be, period? And he's saying, no, certainly when they're in contradiction, we don't do that. And in addition, we don't listen to them when they require of us in worship things that go beyond the scriptures. And even in civil matters, when they go beyond their authority as that has to do with the civil purpose of the state, which is to protect life and property, we don't obey them there either. They've gone beyond their authority and become tyrannical. And now he points out some couple Christian theological things too that would, if we did this, we just listen to them whenever they require something of us in worship that the scriptures don't require. If we did this, we'd be doing a couple things that were in contradiction with the New Testament, for instance. One is that we would be enslaving ourselves to a new master in religion. Or like, put it this way, it would be like going back to the law and its excessive forms of religious worship, according to the New Testament. So you have Paul addressing this issue in the book of Galatians, essentially saying we have gone beyond the administration of God's grace under the law to a greater administration of grace in the New Testament era when it comes to religious worship. At least that's a part of the issue. And there are other texts in the New Testament that deal specifically with specific things where the New Testament is distinct from the Old Testament in terms of dietary regulations and other things related to religious worship. You can look at the book of Hebrews for this as well. So he's saying, look, if the New Testament has liberated us from an excessively burdensome form of religion, he looks at the law and all the things attached to that as being overly burdensome compared to the greater liberty of the New Testament. And so if we allow the state to start adding all these requirements upon us, and we think we should submit to them, we would be placing ourselves again under a yoke of bondage, to use the language of Paul in Galatians. And we should not do that. And then the second theological argument is, look, if you had to obey the state in religious matters, then you would be following two masters. Christ, your king, who's the king over the church in religious matters, and also the state, as if you can serve two masters. And he points to Matthew 23, 8 and 9, which basically claims you can't serve two masters. So those are two other theological arguments that he's added to this. Now we come to that fourth point, after all this digression here, and that fourth point being that because religious freedom is a natural right, then the state is obligated to defend our natural rights and therefore to defend our religious freedom. Okay? So the state's obligated to defend all of our natural rights and including the freedom of religion. And really, that's just logically coherent with everything else he's said before. Now, that basically summarizes the gist of what he's argued. He goes into more details about certain circumstances related to the situation at the time, but I think we've covered the main things that relate to the long-standing issues of religious liberty and his arguments for those that relate to the Constitution. And yet, at the same time, having looked at that argument, some of you might object and say, well, wait a minute. This is an argument based in, at least partly based in Christian obligation to keep the scriptures and religious liberty. And so how does this relate to the liberty of other religions in the United States to have the liberty and freedom to worship as they please, such as Judaism, or in Islam, or Hinduism, or Buddhism? Okay. So do Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims, for instance, have the right to worship under this kind of argument? It sounds like it's purely a Christian argument. And it is true. Within that context, it's primarily a Christian argument. And it is true that he even says at one point that Roman Catholics can't be really a part of this kind of state of religious freedom. However, in their case, it is true that while he does say it's because it's a false religion, but also because implicitly, I think may have actually stated this, is that they're beholden to the Pope. And this was an issue going back in that particular period where the Pope did have political influence among states that where Roman Catholicism was certainly the state religion, and usually it often was where it existed. And we can see this being true, actually, even up to the 1850s in France, where the Pope was exerting influence and authority, trying to, at least, and through certain rulers there, like Napoleon III. So, there is some truth in this, that's one of the reasons why the Protestants didn't want to necessarily accept Catholics into their area and say that they had the freedom of worship, because they saw them as imposing themselves on others and being contentious about the issue of religious freedom. However, with respect to this issue, he does have some interesting statements at the end, which is to say that, even if it's not a Protestant magistrate, that is governing authorities that rule over land, obviously Protestant authorities would have the obligation to give the freedom of religion to Protestants. He's saying even if it was a Catholic magistrates, governing authorities, they would have that obligation to give religious freedom. And even if it was pagans, which he's including all other non-Christian religions under that category, and they were ruling the state, they would be obligated to give religious freedom. And maybe he's hinting at something which isn't the context of his discussion. The context of the discussion is all about, of course, the issue of ministers in Connecticut at the time. So he may be hinting at something which becomes, if nothing else, these kinds of ideas or ideas related to them here become the basis for religious freedom within the United States. And of course, Quakers were on the forefront of this. That is true. But here's an example of what he's arguing for as well. And that is, by the time we get to certainly by the time we get to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we have Presbyterians like John Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton and a minister, who signs the Declaration of Independence, along with deists, like Thomas Jefferson and Franklin and Benjamin Franklin. So they're agreeing to religious freedom. The deists, by the way, don't believe in the unique completeness of Christ's redemption. They basically were people who believed in one God and that we have a moral obligation to obey certain laws of nature and that there is an afterlife where there's punishment and reward. But they did not believe in the Christian view of redemption. So in spite of that, the deists and the Christians agreed on this kind of religious freedom, which would allow toleration for them both. And the Christians were in accord with that as well. And this opened up the door ultimately for Roman Catholics to come in under this religious toleration within the time where George Washington was president of the United States. And then we see that that expanded to other religious groups. And I think what it was is the recognition of people having the natural right as human beings, period, the natural right to religious freedom. And that essentially is part of what Williams is talking about there, talking about John Locke's view and uniting it with his view of toleration. So recognize that people have the natural right to religious freedom. And if they have the natural right to religious freedom, then the state needs to respect that natural right, because they don't have a right to allow the state to persecute them and punish them for the religious views. Very similar to the other natural rights, such as life and property. Now, it is true, there might be some of you as Christians who might say, well, wait a minute, do people who are, not Christians have the right before God to worship as they please? Because certainly Christianity does teach that that all people are sinful and deserving of eternal punishment, and that Christ, being man, bears the sin of human beings, and being God, he could bear the wrath of God in a moment of time and satisfy it and be raised from the dead. And therefore, faith in Christ is required for salvation. So you might think, well, then others outside of Christ don't really have the right to religious freedom. You might think that, or the natural right to it. However, we're not talking about the right before God, okay, to worship as they please. Nor are any of these rights really rights before God. They're rights before a fellow human being, before our fellow human beings in society. And you can think of that even in terms of John Locke's argument for life and property being natural rights. And certainly we have the right before our fellow human beings to life. But do we have the right before God where we can demand that he keep us alive? At least a Christian would say no, because that God is, is able to end a human being's life when it's time, when it's his will. So before God, we don't have the right to life. It's a gift of God, constantly given by God's goodness. And there would be other people in other religious traditions who would acknowledge that as well. So the right to property. I mean, do we have a right before God to have all the property that we have, or to even have? We don't have the right to life before him, and so we don't have the right necessarily to the things that we have, and God may take it away from us, as he did from Job, for instance. Or as anybody might acknowledge that God is the giver of all things, and therefore he can take it away in earthquake and tsunami and all kinds of things. And so these aren't rights before God, they're rights before human beings, rights before our fellow human beings. So that fits with the idea of religious freedom as well. It's a right before our fellow human beings to worship as we please. And somebody might say, well, it's not God's favorite worship. No, but these people have a right before their fellow human beings to worship as they please. and therefore the state has no right to punish them for that. Now, I say there's certainly some qualifications for that. That is, that unless the worship goes beyond and violates the civil rights of others to life and property. I mean, if the worship of a certain group was that they believed in human sacrifice, and they, sought to sacrifice fellow human beings, well, the state could stop that, because, of course, that would be something where they would be violating the natural rights of human beings to life. And the same with theft and property. If a religious group thought that they had to steal things as part of the religious services, then the state could stop that. But other than that, there is this religious freedom that is a natural right. And so this is recognized later by certainly Christians as well as others within the United States. And I will say that there is another aspect of this that one may wonder about, and I'll just point it out, that it is argued later on that this is for Christians, it was argued later on that this is a natural right that God, in effect, gives by his common grace after the fall of Adam and Eve into sin, and would continue on throughout history. But someone might wonder what about the land of Israel at the time when the Israelites went in and killed the Canaanites, and where people were executed for religious beliefs that were within Israel that were contrary to the prescriptions of the God of Israel. And at least the Christian argument was that, and this was true at Princeton Seminary, which following Witherspoon, we get Princeton Seminary later as well. Princeton Seminary would argue that in that unique particular case, the church and the state were united together. They were part of the same sphere, if you will. They may be separate institutions, but they're united together in the same sphere. And it was this way because it was a unique situation in a unique land, which then pointed to heaven and the place of God's bliss of his people and of the worship of God. But that in the New Testament era, since Christ has died, borne the wrath of God, been raised from the dead, and the good news of Christianity, the gospel, goes out to all nations. Therefore, as a result, is not of a particular land. It's not associated with a particular land, and the people are spread out throughout the whole world, mixed with other races. I shouldn't say races, with other religions. Of course, Christianity takes in all races of people. And it is spread amongst the world at large. So the idea there is that Christians now say, no, we live in a world, an arena in which there is religious freedom, religious toleration, and in love and charity, we need to extend that religious freedom to our fellow neighbor, whether that neighbor is a Christian or not. And so, hopefully, through all this, maybe you've gotten a few more insights than you had before on some of the arguments that were made for religious freedom. I know when I read this, I got some insights. So, hope you've enjoyed it, and all the best, everyone. Bye-bye.